a temple to the goddess Isis in Egypt on the Red Sea coast at a port called Berenike, which has been dug now for about 30 years by a team from Chicago. And for many years, they didn't really come across much. And suddenly, in the last 10, they've been unearthing whole layers of material associated with the arrival, the annual arrival in Berenike of a vast Indian merchant fleet, sailing largely from Maziris in Kerala, but also from Barigaza in Gujarat, and the site of Barbaricum, which is near modern Karachi, at the mouth of the Indus. And the material that they've been digging up in the last 10 years, which has received very little publicity in this country, which includes whole amphoras full of black pepper, which was one of the principal items of trade, fragments of textiles, particularly cotton and silk textiles, which was another item of trade, someone's pet monkey, very sweet little detail, and what are called ostraca, these little fragments of pottery with the names of many of the sailors who came. One who calls himself the Chieftain Coran, a lot of Tamil names, a lot of Gujarati names. And this whole world has opened up a field of study which simply didn't exist 20 years ago about the extraordinary connections between India and Rome, which was not an overland trade, but an easy maritime trade that if you got the monsoon winds right and left with the monsoon winds behind you, could get you from Kerala to the Red Sea coast of Egypt in literally 2 months. Then you'd have to wait, maybe go and visit the pyramids, go to the circus at Alexandria, go shopping, do whatever you like. There are references to Indians with houses in Alexandria. So they would go there. And then in August, the winds would reverse and they could sail back in another 2 months. So it was not a difficult trade. Once the art of sailing with this monsoon had been learned, India was in direct contact with the classical world in a way that neither, I think, scholars of Rome nor scholars of India have previously taken into account. Anyway, I received this particular find on an email talking about the close links of India and the Roman world. And Berenike is 5,000 miles west of India, 4,000 miles west of India. I received this email when I was about 6,000 miles east of India at Angkor Wat, which, just for clarity's sake, is the largest Hindu temple in the world. To this day, the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India. It's on the banks of the Mekong. And Angkor Wat, originally a Vishnu temple, though now mainly used as a Buddhist site, is not only the largest Hindu temple in the world, it's the largest medieval religious monument in the world, 4 times the size of the Vatican City, just within the moat. And looking here, you see the extraordinary legacy of India in a different direction, eastwards. In a country where many of the names are derived from Sanskrit, in a country where many of the kings had Sanskritic names, and where the principal river in the 5th century was renamed Ma Ganga, which is what Mekong is in Khmer. It's just Ma Ganga. All this came together and planted the seeds of the book which I've now written. And its architecture of this book is divided into 3 sections of what I think are the 3 principal ideas from India which traveled outwards, or rather the 3 principal package of ideas, because all of them are portfolios full of different ideas. The first is the idea of Buddhism, and we'll deal with this first, and how it spread through China to Korea, Japan, and as far north as Mongolia and Siberia, bringing with it a whole body of Indic literature and Indic science and other Indic ideas, impregnated within the religion, ideas of kalpas and yupas and all sorts of ideas that had originated in this country, arrived as a package with the spread of Buddhism. Secondly, the spread of Hinduism and Hindu kingship and Sanskrit and that whole portfolio of ideas from the 6th and 7th century to Southeast Asia, of which Angkor Wat is the culmination. And thirdly, the idea of Indian mathematics and astronomy and astrology, all three of which were combined in a single science in ancient India, which was called Jyotisa. And this study of mathematics and the urge to understand the stars was rooted in an attempt to try and understand omens and astrology. Today we think of the daily horoscope in the newspaper and NASA as being two very different things. But in ancient India, of course, closely allied, in fact, one science. And this Indian ideas of mathematics, which are already highly developed in the Vedas, but which reached their golden age and leap forward much later in the 5th and 6th centuries, cross-fertilized with Persian, Babylonian, and Greek ideas, resulting in the extraordinary advances of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, passes through the Arab world, and we'll talk about the way that happened, in the 8th century, and finally, laggardly, as late as the 12th century, Indian numbers and zero finally reach Europe. And again, we'll talk about the method of this happening. Now, why is it that the rest of the world does not think of India as the center of the ancient world? And why is it that so few people in Britain to this day have ever heard of Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta, though everyone in the country will learn about Archimedes and Pythagoras by the age of 5 or 6? Well, one answer, and probably the answer that would be most readily offered by an Indian audience, would be colonialism and the tendency of British Indologists such as Macaulay to do down the literature and languages and science of India. Macaulay's famous quote that a single shelf of good English books is worth the entire native literature of India and Arabia. That, obviously we laugh at that today, but the shadows of that remain in national curriculums and museum displays to this day. But there's another idea which I think has subtly undermined the primacy of India, and that's this very lovely idea of the Silk Road. This idea that there was an ancient trade route that ran across the narrow waist of Asia from the Mediterranean, across Persia and Central Asia, and ended up at Chang'an, Loyang, and the South China Sea terminus of what has been known as the trade route. Now, I think everyone today assumes that the Silk Road is a fact, and that it is an ancient fact, and that it is referred to by documents going back millennia, but that is a mistake. Marco Polo, probably the person most closely associated with the Silk Road, never mentions it. That no Chinese document ever talks about the Silk Road. In fact, the Silk Road is an invention of a German geographer, Baron von Richthofen, writing in 1877 in a book called Die Seidenstraßen, The Silk Roads. And he is planning a colonial railway from Berlin to Peking, and this idea is mooted and projected as an ancient idea. It enters English in 1936 with a Swedish Nazi sympathizing historian called Sven Hedin. And Sven Hedin talks at length about the Silk Road. And by the time that I was a student in the 1980s, it had become something which bars and hotels were named after in Kashgar and Afghanistan, and hotels, even in Istanbul, were called the Silk Road Hotel. And it's a very attractive idea because it breaks down national silos. It talks about globalization centuries before globalization is supposed to have happened. It evokes images of camels crossing the Pamirs and sand dunes, and it's all very lovely. But I think it's a myth, but certainly before the 13th century. There are many trade routes, of course, which pass through these areas. But the idea that there was one east-west motorway in ancient times is nonsense, because Persia and Rome were at war. There was a hostile border. A merchant traveling by land could not pass through the border for most of the time between ancient Persia and Rome, and then Byzantium, and the Sasanian Empire, again, a hostile border. In fact, it's only in the 13th century with the Mongols, and the Mongols are an important part of this story, and the reason that the Golden Road, which I'm going to talk about, comes to an end, is that the Mongols smash through Asia, destroying everything in their path, and creating, for the first time, a single country linking the Mediterranean with Mongolia. And it is along that route in 1271 that Marco Polo passes with just one passport from the Great Khan. But up to that point, this had been many different countries, many different borders, and traveling by camel or donkey was a tricky matter. To take precious goods overland was even trickier. And if you think there's only so much you can put in a saddlebag, even of a large Bactrian donkey, even a large Bactrian camel. And there's also this more recent idea of the maritime Silk Road, which you can see on this map, passing round the Malacca Straits and sort of bypassing India. But again, bypassing India. Now, this is a myth because it was India, not China, that was the principal trading partner of the Roman Empire. There is not a single piece of evidence that Rome and China clearly knew of each other's existence. No embassy passes between the two. There is no trade mission which is recorded as successfully setting off from one and arriving in the other. In contrast, Strabo, a Greek geographer based in Alexandria, talks of visiting the Red Sea coast with the governor of Egypt and a fleet of 250 vessels waiting to leave for India with the monsoon winds. 250 vessels, a fleet of that size, setting off for India. Pliny, 1st century AD, talks about the wealth of the Roman Empire draining into Roman pockets. Sorry, the wealth of the Roman Empire draining into Indian pockets, and how the taste of degenerate, luxurious women in Rome who wanted silks and with see-through textiles, which he means silk, and this newfangled black pepper which people put on their food, by which he means pepper, how this is draining all the money from Rome and sending it off to foreign, possibly hostile nations. He's a very familiar type, Pliny. You could imagine a version of him possibly sitting at some point in the Cassorli bar holding forth. He's a naval commander, doesn't like anything new, very conservative, and wants everything to be simple and straightforward and as it used to be. Yeah, so we know that type, and he disapproves of India entirely on that basis. So memorize that map for a second. Put that into your mind's eye, this mythical Silk Road, and compare it with this map, which had just emerged from the Oxford Archaeology Department. This is an actual map of something that is tangible, which is Roman coin hoards. And it shows where Roman coin hoards have been found. And they've been found, obviously, in Italy, France, Spain, southern England, tailing off towards Scandinavia and Scotland, very few in Ireland, all around the coast of the Mediterranean, a little tail down the Nile, a couple in Yemen on the borders of the Red Sea, a few in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But not one Roman coin hoard has ever once been found in China. Not one. And yet look at the southern coast of India. Look from Bombay, Goa, down to Kerala, up through Tamil Nadu, absolutely riddled with Roman coin hoards, as they have been discovered since East India Company factors started noting them in the 18th century. When they talk of barrow loads of Roman coins, often gold, turning up on the coast of India. Because Roman gold ended up here because there was so much that the Romans wished to buy in India. So this is what I'm proposing as an alternative to the Silk Road, and one that I believe that up to the 12th century is a far more historical idea than this mythologized, much mythologized Silk Road. That from the early centuries you have maritime routes sailing out of India. Initially, the biggest one is on the west coast of India, sailing to Egypt. But by the 5th century, Rome has fallen. The Huns have besieged Rome, And there's a major economic crisis in India because all this gold, which has been pouring very easily into Indian pockets, now stops. What happens is that the Tamil trading guilds, of whom more later, pivot eastwards. And where do they look for gold? Of course, they look in Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold, which is Malaysia and Thailand. And particularly they look at Savarna Dvipa, the island of gold, which is probably Sarawak. In the Ramayana, Sugriva tells Hanuman, in Savarna Dvipa, you only have to kick the ground and gold dust flies in the air. So from the 5th century, you begin to get Indian merchants going in larger and larger numbers towards Southeast Asia. At the same time, in the 5th century, you get the first wooden Buddhas, followed in the 6th century by the first Hindu temples, followed by larger and larger Hindu and Buddhist structures until eventually you end up in the 12th century with Angkor Wat. So, let's start with the first of these 3 ideas, with Buddhism. The Buddha, of course, a historical character, mid-5th century BC, but oddly invisible for 200 years. There's very, very little Buddhist activity that one can point to solidly and say this is a Buddhist vihara, this is a Buddhist stupa, before the time of Ashoka. And it's only with Ashoka in 250 BC that we get tangible evidence of Buddhism, both in his inscriptions and in stone monuments. That doesn't mean that there weren't other ones, but they were built in wood or bamboo, and we've lost all sign of them. But there's no question that Ashoka supercharges the whole thing. He turns what's essentially still a relatively local cult and makes it not just a national cult of his empire, an imperial cult, but also something which he's so excited about that he wants to tell everyone beyond the borders. So in the Kandahar inscription, we hear about missionaries being sent as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya, which is a very long way. We have echoes of Ashoka's inscriptions in Greek inscriptions in Anatolia, implying that there were Indian missionaries taking these ideas as far as what's now Turkey. And you see also the spread southwards through India into the Deccan, the famous Padmapani at Ajanta, the less famous but no less remarkable early Deccan rock monasteries like this one at Baja, perfectly preserved just outside Pune. An hour outside Pune, you come to this, probably the oldest complete Buddhist monastery in the world and almost unvisited today. You'll be the only person or one of a handful of people if you go there. You climb half an hour up a hill, and you arrive at this. And what you've got here is frozen in carved stone, a representation of that wooden and bamboo architecture which has disappeared. And not only is the wood visible through the stone, there is actually fragments of wood surviving within the cave. In the dryness of this cave, you have the wooden teak umbrella and the rafters dating from 150 BC. Further south, Mahinda, the son of Ashoka, is sent to Anuradhapura, where he makes Buddhism's first big conquest, if you like, which is the conversion of the people of Sri Lanka. And this is still being uncovered. 2 years ago, this very primitive, simple, very early stupa was found on the hilltop of Rajagala in central Sri Lanka with the Brahmi inscription Mahinda on it. So this is apparently one of the very first stupas in the world. It's a simple, rough-hewn blocks of stone covering the cremation of the son of Ashoka who brought Buddhism to Sri Lanka. On the left is the far more familiar shape of a stupa that we're more used to. But this is how it began. This is the prototype on the right, newly discovered. So Sri Lanka becomes a major center for the diffusion of Buddhism, and within a couple of hundred years, you've got almost like a franchise, monasteries in Sri Lanka setting up branches in Java, in Indonesia, and Burma. The Abhayagiri monastery being a good example. The original Abhayagiri monastery is just outside Anuradhapura. There's another Abhayagiri monastery just outside Prambanan in Yogyakarta. But by 100 AD, this is the picture. And this is based on the kind of Lonely Planet or the rough guide of the Roman trading world called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And what's extraordinary about this rough guide is that in contrast to China, where they say, and that's up at the top, very far away there is said to be a city called Thebes where silk comes from. And it's hard to get to. In contrast to that, the Periplus knows the detail of every single port on the West Indian coast and several on the East Indian coast. And it knows every quirk. It knows which ones you need to have a pilot helping you into the harbor. It knows which one, for example, there's a particularly sort of kinky king in Gujarat that seems to like Roman singing boys, and they say there's a premium on importing Roman singing boys if you take it to Gujarat, and so on, all the details. And these guys are sailing with the monsoon winds over the water to Aden, then up the Arabian Gulf. The two important ports are Myas Hormuz, which is here translated correctly as Mussel Harbor, at the top of the Red Sea, and the main port, Berenike, halfway down. Then further down still, you get Adulis and Aksum, which are the Ethiopian kingdoms, which are also part of the story. You also get the big Persian ports. Underrated in the Periplus because they were often at war with the Romans, but a very important trading zone nonetheless. The Ethiopians appear in Indian monuments, though I've never seen this highlighted anywhere. Look on the right, this very tall, handsome Ethiopian prince it is maybe, with a sword and a long gown, being introduced, and you can see the whole scene here, to an Indian prince. This is from Amaravati in Andhra Pradesh, with his pages or children, all with cornrow hair from Ethiopia, under this Indian Buddhist ruler, offering gifts. This is now in the Madras Central Museum, covered with horrible perspex and very badly displayed. An absolute crying shame. This needs a museum to itself. It's a spectacular set of sculptures. So we know the details of all this because 15 years ago, an extraordinary manuscript turned up on the market in Egypt, probably illegally excavated, probably from a site called Oxyrhynchus, now in Vienna. Now, this Oxyrhynchus is an extraordinary site where a whole load of documents have survived in the rubbish dumps of Oxyrhynchus. An ode, a lesbian ode of Sappho, the lost gospel of Thomas. These sort of things have been turning up in large numbers. And this is from the rubbish dump, and it's a completely random shipping invoice for one container, which happened to move from Kerala to Alexandria around 40 AD, just after the death of Jesus Christ. And this document records the contents in great detail and, most importantly, the prices. So it says what the main imports are in this particular container on this one particular ship called the Hamapollon. And we have an illustration of these goods in this extraordinary mosaic in Sicily, presumably associated with a merchant who made his fortune from this trade. And what we have in the center is an Indian yakshi, this voluptuous figure touching a tree. She seems to be based on a Kushan yakshi, these amazing figures one gets in Mathura. Again, touching a tree. You see at the top the leaves of the tree that she's holding on to. Not perhaps the first thing that catches your attention when you look at her, but we'll pass over that. Hang on, we're going the wrong direction. This clicker is proving a little bit problematic. If we can... Oh, we might have to do it manually. I think it's running out of batteries. Oh, hang on, we're back. So here in the center is this yakshi based on an Indian original. And look, she's wearing exactly the sort of diaphanous silk that Pliny was furious about. You can actually see her limbs through the silk. And this is the sort of thing which Pliny thought was outrageous and shouldn't be encouraged. She's holding ivory, which is the principal product in the Hamapollon container. And in fact, there are 2 tons of ivory in this one container. Behind her are strings of pepper. On the top right are peppercorns on the vine. And I think maybe round her neck is Indian gemstones, which was another very important product. The mistress of Nero was so excited by her expensive Indian gemstones, which she had all over her hair, her breasts, and her feet, according to one source, that she actually carried the receipts to parties to show off to people, to show how expensive they were at Roman imperial parties. And onyx and diamonds and so on was another major item of trade. Then we have circus animals, elephants and tigers, which would appear in the Colosseum. And the boats in Berenike are much larger than Mediterranean boats, partly because they often carried elephants. And apparently we're going to see a reflection of this in the forthcoming Gladiator 2, those of you who are Ridley Scott fans, because we're seeing a rhinoceros, possibly from Kaziranga, appearing and taking on the hero of Gladiator 2 next month. And finally, discreetly in the back corner, a plant which I think is Malabathrum, which is a very important source of Roman perfumery, also an Indian product. So, to go back to the Muziris Papyrus, what's important about this document is it gives exact prices for each of these things. And what has astonished economic historians is that it is hugely more expensive than anyone realized. In fact, if this container did successfully make it, which it presumably did, from Kerala to Alexandria, the importers stood to be able to buy with the profits any large estate in Egypt, or even one of the larger estates in central Tuscany, the prime real estate of, what was the name of the wonderful company that's sponsoring us as building Eco Homes in Goa? The equivalent of that in central Tuscany in the 1st century would have been available to this importer. In fact, he would effectively become the Elon Musk or the Mark Zuckerberg of 1st century Egypt if he got just one very large cargo with 2 tons of ivory over the seas to the Nile, shipped it to Alexandria, and sold it successfully. But it's not just that the merchants were becoming rich and rich enough to build these sort of extraordinary villas with lovely mosaics. You also have the Roman state doing very well with this. And this is why, perhaps, despite Pliny's pleas that the money was debouching out into Indian pockets, why the Roman state permitted this trade, because there is a 30% tax on imports. And economic historians are now calculating that if you've got 250 vessels leaving from Myos Hormuz in a single year, arguably as much as 1/5 to 1/3 of the entire Roman imperial budget, building all the Roman roads, the Hadrian's Wall, the forts in Algeria, the Rhine frontier, 1/3 of the Roman imperial budget came from the customs take on the Red Sea ports. That's how much money was passing backwards and forwards. Which again puts this mythical Silk Road nonsense completely out of the park. There is no evidence for it, while we have ample evidence for the centrality of India. And we have many Indian products turning up in Western excavations. This is yet another Yakshis. Yakshis were clearly rather like sort of Bollywood film posters or something. Large busty women was an early Indian export that did very well in the Roman world. But we also get a great deal of Roman products turning up in the Indian world. Here we have 3 beakers from originally made in Alexandria, and I owe Kasoli resident Naman Ahuja, I don't know whether he's around today, but to thank for these pictures, which are his. In the center we have the Pharos lighthouse, on the left a gladiator, on the right the vine harvest. These were found, of all places, under the American Air Force Base in Bagram outside Kabul. Brought to Barakam, punted up the Indus, then on through the Kabul River, and dumped in a merchant storeroom in Bagram in the Shamali Plain. And we also see, once we start looking at it, the influence of Roman Egyptian art. Remember, it's specifically Roman Egyptian rather than Roman, because it's coming through Egypt, on Gandharan sculpture. So in the center, we have Isis suckling Horus from Antinoe in Egypt. You have the child reaching for the breast, and the drapery between her knees falling in this pattern. On the left, we've got the same image, very similar, from Peshawar. But this time, it's no longer Horus and Isis, Horus, the baby, being suckled by his mother Isis, it's Hariti, who is a major figure in the Jataka stories of the Buddhists. And Hariti was a Yakshi, another of these Yakshis that was so important in early Indian art. And she had a bad case of addiction to eating little children. Until she met the Buddha and became a vegetarian, after which she became the Buddhist patron saint of children, which was a remarkable career development. And you can see her all over the little children tumbling around her throne in this picture. But again, the same iconography. Here again, in the center, you've got a Gandharan mural from Miran and two Coptic ones from Egypt on either side to show how similar the art is. The same way of doing a chin, the same black and red pigments. The central one is now in the National Museum in Delhi, the two on either side in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Trouble with the clicker again. Here we go. Here we have the Buddha. The Buddha and his disciples. We can go back. This is going to become a problem. Have you got any more batteries? Here we go. There we are. The Buddha and his disciples from Miran, a Coptic papyrus of exactly the same scene of Jesus and his disciples. So you've got two different religions, but the same iconography and ideas passing between the two with incredible ease. And the biggest Roman import is the image of the Buddha. The Buddha in this country is originally shown as a pair of feet, or a tree, or an empty throne, or a turban. In the 1st century AD, he suddenly begins to appear as a figure apparently influenced by Apollo. This is one of the very first such images in the Bimaran reliquary found in the Khyber Pass. And from that moment onwards, you get these incredible classical Buddha faces turning up. Now, the Victorians, when these images first started turning up, had read far too much Kipling, and they interpreted this as the art of the Greeks who'd got stranded in Afghanistan. Remember the famous story of the man who would be king, Peachy Carnahan, one of Khushwant's favorite stories. Peachy Carnahan, who gets stuck in Afghanistan, and there's the film with Michael Caine and Sean Connery. I don't know whether any of you have seen it. Anyway, this is all rubbish, because the Bactrian Greeks are actually out of the picture by 150 BC, and these images do not turn up, even the first of them, until the 1st century AD. And then all three of these, the classical high Buddhist images in Gandharan art are from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD. And they are not the result of the influence of Greek art. They are the result, again, this clicker is playing up. Can you do it manually? Excuse me, sir, could you wind the one slide forward manually? It's not working. Here we go. Could you remain there, because it's not. Okay, so this is an image of Augustus from Rome. This is an image of the Bodhisattva from Peshawar, and you can see how exactly the same drapery is being used. So the influence is actually of contemporary Roman sculpture, not ancient Greek sculpture. Anyway, next slide. As we head upwards, there's gorgeous images of the Buddha from Hadda in Afghanistan. Next. Next, please. Up into Mezainak, which is this extraordinary Buddhist site outside Kabul. Now, what's been found there is not only images of Durga, but a whole range of Indic finds clearly linked to the Gangetic Plains. And the impression that you're getting is that as the Kushans move southwards, coming down from what's now Xinjiang, conquering what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and fighting their way through at least to Mathura, where they found one of their capitals in the 2nd century, having all this area under one rule allowed Buddhist missionaries and monks to head in the opposite direction, up into central Afghanistan and beyond into Central Asia. And Buddhism by the 1st and 2nd century is a big deal in Afghanistan. Next slide, please. Here we have Bamiyan. You can see the cliffs riddled with monastery caves. And one of the things that's now possible to ask is that if Buddhist monasticism is there from about 200 BCE, and Christian monasticism only begins in the 3rd century AD, is it possible that this habit of carving out rock faces, living in caves in the desert, is an idea from India which spreads to, where's the first monastery? The Red Sea coast of Egypt. St. Anthony of Egypt goes from Alexandria to the Red Sea coast, and he founds Christian monasticism. St. Paul the Hermit follows, and you end up by the 4th century with the desert becoming a city. And perhaps the biggest hint of this is that early Christian monasticism is uniquely vegetarian. So I think one can add to the quiver of ideas that India provides to the world the idea of monasticism and its influence on the Christian world. Next slide. So as you head into China, you see the Buddha looking more and more Chinese. Next slide. Next slide, please. And Buddhism arrives in China by the 1st century AD. It becomes initially a religion brought by foreign merchants, but by the 2nd and 3rd century, next slide, you have Indian Buddhist art from Mathura and Gupta art being copied increasingly in China as it spreads through Gansu and heads eastwards towards the coast. Next slide. You find Indian apsaras and gandharvas flying and swimming over the domes of the great monasteries of Central Asia. Next slide. Some of the monks are smoking something pretty strong. Next slide. I don't know what they had, what they were puffing to produce blue elephants, but I want a puff of it too. Next slide. And by the 5th and 6th centuries, Buddhism has arrived as a minority faith at the court in China. Underneath the Confucians, less important than Taoism, but growing in importance every single year. Next slide. Whoops, one slide, so go back one if you would. There we go. So the man responsible for changing this in an extraordinary way is the famous Chinese monk Xuanzang. Xuanzang, with his fancy backpack full of scrolls, arrives from China in the mid-7th century looking for uncorrupted Buddhist documents. He thinks that everything that he has in China is badly translated, lost in translation. He wants to get the original Buddhist documents. Where does he go? He goes to the university monastery of Nalanda. Next slide. Now, Nalanda is the most important center of Indian soft power. Scandalously, only 1/10 of this site has been excavated. The ASI is so underfunded that only 1/10 has been looked at. And yet you could not have a site which is more important to the history of Indian culture and its export abroad and the story of Indian soft power. It's a measure of how much there's so much talk about national pride from certain governments, but very little expression of it in actually funding the ASI or universities so that these things can be properly explored. And Indian museums remain scandalously underfunded and shabby looking compared to even places like Turkey. You go to Turkey now, Erdogan has built these massive museums in every provincial town. Very, very smart, modern, spotlit, beautifully arranged museums. Here, every city now has a new airport, but the ASI museums are still shoddy, badly lit with light bulbs that haven't been replaced and all the rest of it. And nowhere do you see this more than in London, where only 1/10 of arguably the most important site of scholarship in India, not arguably, definitely the most important site of scholarship in India, remains largely undiscovered. But what we do know from the excavations of what has been excavated is that here is the origin of the plan which goes on to be the form of every university in the modern world. A courtyard on the right, a cloister walk, and scholars' rooms lining all 4 sides of the cloister. You get that in the madrasas of Islam. You then get it in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The only difference is that in Oxford and Cambridge you get a lawn, while here they're baked brick. But the thing that Xuanzang was really interested in was the library. 9 stories high, the richest in the Indic world, the richest in anywhere in Asia. And Xuanzang spends 20 years copying out manuscripts, not just Buddhist texts, largely Buddhist texts. His particular interest is the Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism, and that's what he first comes looking for. But once he's there, he dives into the library where there is material on the Vedas, on science, on mathematics, on astronomy, astrology. Everything of the Indic world is available and is studied at this university. And Xuanzang is amazed by this. He's saying that the young and the old work together with mutual respect. Everyone is a scholar. He's never been anywhere like it. No kid arriving at Harvard or Oxford for the first time has ever been more impressed by a university than Xuanzang, who incidentally is the grandson of the rector of Peking University, Xi'an University. And so he's from an academic background and knows about universities. He thinks Nalanda is off the charts. The Oxbridge, the Ivy League, the NASA of its day. Next slide. And here is what remains of the library. But as I say, most of this site remains undug, and who knows what we can find. Next slide. Already we have from Nalanda this copper plate, which gives a hint of the sort of place that India had at this point. This is a founding charter of a college on the edge of Nalanda for the use of Southeast Asian monks from what is now Indonesia, was then Srivijaya. But we know that other monks came from as far away as Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, Korea, and Japan. So this was the major center of scholarship in Asia. There was no question of going off to university somewhere in America or something. Monks from the rest of Asia come to Nalanda, come to Bihar of all places, to study. Next slide. Now, when Xuanzang makes it back to China, he finds an unlikely ally in this young woman. When he comes back, he's probably hitting late 60s or 70. He's been 20 years in India. This young woman is 15-year-old, and she is a 5th-ranking concubine in the imperial harem. Next slide. Taizong, the first Tang emperor who had united China, had this young woman, this is her in middle age, obviously, or maybe even in old age, as in charge of the bed linen. It's not clear whether they were lovers, but she was certainly the lover of his son, because when he gets mortally ill and Xuanzang is sitting by his bed teaching him the stories of Buddhism, young Wu Zetian is busy carousing with Gaizong against all known taboos of father, sons, and all the rest of it. And when Taizong dies, Wu is sent off along with the other wives and concubines to a nunnery, but Gaizong bails her out after a year and she's brought back. There is then a scandalous a detective story. Next slide. You get much more of an idea what's going on from the recent Chinese soap opera about this. Wu Zetian is this unbelievably gorgeous young woman, and she becomes pregnant by Gaizong, the son. She gives birth. 6 months later, the baby is found strangled. There is an inquiry. And what seems to have happened is that Wu Zetian has strangled the baby herself, but framed the empress and made it look as if the chief concubine was also doing witchcraft to kill the child. So in one single stroke, there's a trial. The chief concubine and the empress are found guilty. Their bones are broken, and they're left to drown in a vat of rice wine. Wu becomes empress. Then Gaizong has a mysterious series of strokes, and she becomes the power behind the curtain, making the decisions as her husband's in the bedroom, paralyzed. And then he finally dies, and she has spent half her life preparing for this moment. With Xuanzang's help, she effectively pulls off a Mahayana Buddhist coup d'etat at court. And using her sort of think tank, which is called the Scholars of the Northern Gate, who are all Nalanda-trained Buddhist monks, she becomes the only female emperor in 3,000 years of Chinese history. Not dowager empress, not chief consort, not wife, but emperor. Now, this is not allowed in China, and in order for it to happen, she has to get rid of the Confucians and the Taoists at court. And who does she replace them with? Nalanda-trained Buddhists, Chinese and Indian. So an important moment in Indian history when you effectively have a coup d'etat, an Indian coup d'etat. Forget assassins running around in Toronto. This is the real thing. India actually takes over. India actually takes over a foreign country. And this is the high watermark of Indian influence in Asia. Because at the same time as all this is going on in the 660s, next slide, dramatic things are happening. Next slide, please. Dramatic things are happening in Southeast Asia. Next slide. So remember we were talking about all that Roman trade. That ends very suddenly in the 5th century when Attila the Hun besieges Rome. Incidentally, what does he ask as ransom? Not Chinese silk, but 10,000 pounds of black Indian pepper. Anyway, Rome eventually falls, and this produces a major economic crisis in India, because India has just been coining it, literally. With this, they only have to send off a few elephant tusks and some pepper, and gold pours into India for 400 years. Now, suddenly, it's stopped, dead. What happens? So, the people who spring into action are an organization, or a pair of organizations, which have been made to sound quite incredibly boring in the economic history of early India, if you read the standard books, but actually sound incredibly fascinating. These are the early Tamil merchant guilds. These guys not only have their own mercenary armies, a bit like the East India Company, but 1,000 years earlier, they also have, and this is the kind of Game of Thrones moment and why it's got to be made into a movie, they also have a corps of assassins who track down and kill anyone that's ambushed the merchant caravans. So these guys mean business. And they spring into action, and they begin. There's always been a trade route moving eastwards out of Mahabalipuram and Nagapattinam, but now it really becomes a big deal. You get these harbors enlarged, and you get these eastern trade routes founded, and gold begins to be exported. We find the touchstones of Tamil touchstones of Tamil gold workers appearing at gold working sites. Gold mines in the narrowest strip of the, can you see where it says Okay? If you go to that little narrow strip of what's southern Malaysia, northern Thailand, there's a great deal of gold there, and also Kutai on Sarawak, where there is more gold workings. Next slide. And these merchants are crossing the sea in boats like this, sewn boats, which are making the monsoon voyage very quickly down the Malacca Straits with the monsoon winds. Next slide. And by the 5th and 6th centuries, we're beginning to see these wheels of the law modeled on sculptures in Sarnath, appearing all over what's early Thailand or Dvaravati, as the kingdom is called. Next slide. And the main early site of influence, of interest to the Tamil merchants is the Mekong Delta. Because here you can park your ships during the winter and you can get on with your trade. And to this day, the Khmer canals which cross this delta as sort of motorways for the newly arriving ships are still there. And you sail along them on a motorboat, next slide, and you come down, and eventually you end up at one of the many hills on the edge of the delta. And on almost every one of these, there is a monastery or a temple. But in this one in particular, Angkor Borei, next slide, you get the very first Hindu temple in Southeast Asia, Ashram Razai. Next slide. And in here, you get these extraordinary figures of Vishnu. Extraordinary because they're extremely beautiful, they're larger than life size, but also oddly unfamiliar. They obey the Shilpa Shastras. They've got, Vishnu has his conch, he has his discus, but he is now a Khmer Vishnu. He looks like a Khmer, and he's wearing a sampot, which is the lungi of the Khmers. Next slide. Other strange things begin to develop. This is Jayavarman II, the emperor that founds the Angkor dynasty. He has himself depicted as Lord Vishnu. Now, I'm not aware of that happening anywhere in India. You have Rajaraja Chola with Lord Shiva, but I don't think you have Rajaraja Chola as Lord Shiva. I might be wrong about this, but I don't know no example of what you get in the top right-hand corner. You see there's the face of Jayavarman, but he's got a discus in his left hand and a conch on his right. Next. So, and you have his consort as Durga. So as Hinduism develops in Southeast Asia, it's Hinduism, and yet it's an unfamiliar form of Hinduism. You get female Brahmins officiating at the royal temples. There is no caste, and everyone eats pork. It's rather a nice version of Hinduism, actually. Next slide. And here's what's going on. Large numbers of Brahmins are turning up. They're doing abhisheka ceremonies over the local rulers who are sitting there looking very pleased with themselves, because suddenly they're no longer Kodanga, the local chieftain. They are Suryavarman, protected by the sun, or Mahendravarman, protected by Mahendra. And they're now linked to the gods, which is a big deal. You know, it's not just that you're the local strongman with a big army. You've got Lord Shiva on your side. And you've got all these guys doing your administration for you. Next slide. They are not meant to be there, of course, because the laws of Manu forbid, and the Puranas both forbid travel across the Black Waters. How do they get around this? They carve the headwaters of the Mekong, the Siem Reap River, with lingams and yonis, and they sacralize it. So this now becomes the Ganga, and it's known as Ma Ganga today. Mekong is Ma Ganga in Khmer pronunciation. So this is a new boundary for India. India is extended. You get a new Kurukshetra in Laos, a new Ayodhya on the outskirts of Bangkok, a new Ma Ganga running down the middle of the peninsula. But it's not the India we know. It's a slightly different India. And everyone is listening to the Mahabharata, everyone is watching the Ramayana, but in a million ways, it's slightly odd. Next slide. Look at the architecture. You've got here on the left the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram. 5 years later, an almost identical temple is built in Gedong Songo in Java, in an active volcano. Similar, but not quite the same. Look at the little Chinese eaves on the edge of the finials. Look at the tall, narrow gateways. This is Pallava architecture, and yet it's not quite Pallava architecture. Next slide. Here again in the Dieng Plateau, more Pallava temples, 40 temples erected in a site associated with ancestor worship. Next slide. Next slide. And in every Southeast Asian court, you now have the Pallava Grantha script, which is the southern Tamil form of Brahmi, becoming the basis for every pre-Islamic script in Southeast Asia. Khmer, Pyu, Thai, Mon, the whole range of Southeast Asian scripts are based on this South Indian script, first formed in Kanchipuram. You can't use the North Indian scripts, you know, the Devanagari letters hanging from a washing line, if you like, because it will rip through palm leaves. So you have to have a circular script which doesn't break the palms. And this is the form of the writing which is imported to Southeast Asia. Next slide. You get whole cycles of the Ramayana being erected by the 9th century before similar cycles were erected in India. The Ramayana comes from India, but its first depiction, scene by scene in sculpture, is in Prambanan before it's in Hampi. And here is Prambanan, which is now the beginning of what's happening. A lot of these Indian kingdoms are larger than the kingdoms at the time in India, because India is fractured into many competing polities. And so the Southeast Asian Hindu kingdoms are not only casteless, with women Brahmins and eating pork, but they're also richer and able to build bigger temples. Next slide. By the 9th century, you've got the largest Buddhist monument in the world erected at Borobudur. Incredible 5-story step pyramid based on precedents at Kesaria in Bihar and at Sompur Mahavihara in Bangladesh, but on a vastly different scale. A plan of a mandala, protecting it with sacred power. 5 different stories. You start at the bottom with the story of the Buddha. You work through more esoteric Mahayana texts as you go upwards. And it is an engine of enlightenment. It's an incredibly powerful monument, and it's almost certainly designed by a Pallava exile called Dharmabodhi, who was a prince of Pallava Kanchipuram, who goes to China and stops off in Java on the way and forms the plan for this. Next slide. Next slide. Finally, you end up with the enormous 5 towers of Angkor Wat, the largest Hindu temple in the world. Next slide. By the 12th century. Now, we have one last thing to cover before we run out of time. Next slide. The whole story of Indian mathematics. Now, we're now going to go back 600 years to the Guptas. Next slide. At the time that Udaygiri is built by Chandragupta II, he's the kind of rather gym-bodied figure without a head at the back of these 3 figures. In the front, you've got Varaha with Bhudevi hanging from his tusk, emerging from the flood, with his foot on the coils of a Naga serpent king, with Chandragupta behind. And under the Guptas, you get this moment when India is very open to outside influence. The Yavana Sutras, which is basically the work of Euclid, has arrived from Greece. Other Babylonian and Persian texts are being built. And this stimulates the great, massive leap forward that is the work of Aryabhatta. Aryabhatta, working out of Bihar again, produces the circumference of the Earth and the distance of the Earth from the Moon. He works out a version of pi, and he works out the fact that the Earth spins on its own axis. A generation later, Brahmagupta, sitting in Mount Abu of all places, the Rajasthani version of Kasoli in some ways, comes up with the strict mathematical definition of 0. 0 had existed for a while as a placeholder, as an absence, but Brahmagupta realizes that it is an active number in its own right, that it's got certain properties. For example, it's what you get if you subtract a number from itself, and that it therefore is an active number, not a passive absence. And that is what gives the Indian 0 of Brahmagupta its power. It allows for decimal place values, tens, hundreds, thousands, and suddenly Indian mathematics takes off. Next slide. The earliest dated 0 we have is not in India, fun enough. It's in Southeast Asia. It's in Siem Reap, K127, middle line, second line down, middle. Between the 2 tadpoles, that dot is the world's first dated 0 from the, I think, 627 or a date like that. Next slide. But a century later, you get the more familiar form of 0. Look at the 270 in the second line on the right, turning up in Gwalior. Now, that is a rather disappointingly mundane inscription. It's actually about the number of marigolds that somebody has to give to the temple. But that is this crucial moment. Next slide. And we also have the Bakshali manuscript from near Peshawar, which also has an early 0s, and may be the oldest, but is undateable. And there's lots of arguments about its date. Next slide. Next slide. Here we go. So this is the crucial map that should be taught in every school in the world, but isn't. Here's where our numbers come from. Brahmi. Here's the Gwalior inscription with the polo mint 0 at the end. That goes into 3 different versions. The Devanagari letters, used in India. The East Arabic numbers, used in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And the West Arabic numbers, which were developed in Spain and in Morocco, which become the modern European numbers by the 16th century. Next slide. How do they get to the Arab world? Well, improbably, a Disney character turns up in the story at this point. Those of you that sat through the Disney Aladdin will have met Jafar with his parrot. Hands up who's watched the Disney movie. There's a few guilty parents here. And Jafar is actually a historical character. He appears in the Arabian Nights. He's the friend of Harun al-Rashid. And he's actually the 4th generation of a family of viziers who built Baghdad and ruled it for its first 4 generations, called the Barmakids. Now, the Barmakids, crucially, were Buddhist. They were Buddhist abbots from Balkh in Afghanistan who convert to Islam at the first great eruption of the Arabs out of the Hejaz. And they become effectively the Indian accountants because one of their number has studied higher mathematics in Kashmir. And they become the Indian accountants behind the Abbasid revolution in the mid-8th century. One of them was at school with Al-Mansur, and he does the accounts so successfully that he's made the vizier of the new city of Baghdad. Next slide. The Barmakids, for 4 generations, rule the Arab world. And the first thing they do is they send to Sindh for a copy of the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta. Next slide. Eventually, the Barmakids are horribly massacred. There's a kind of red wedding stroke, sort of a Godfather moment when they are arrested, tortured, gibbeted. But the works that they brought from India remain in the Beit al-Hikmah, the great library of Baghdad. Next slide. And a generation later, a kid turns up from what's now northern Uzbekistan, Khiva. That area is known to the Arabs and the Persians as Khwarazm. And so this kid who arrives in Baghdad is known as Al-Khwarizmi, the guy from Khwarazm. And he finds all these texts sitting, gathered by the Barmakids, in a special Sanskrit section in the Beit al-Hikmah. And he understands Sanskrit, and he unravels these complex Sanskrit texts. Now, Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, astonishingly, wrote their mathematics in the form of a Sanskrit poetry, which is almost incomprehensible. It's easy to memorize, but it's almost incomprehensible if you haven't got a commentary. So Al-Khwarizmi is the one who unravels this into prose and writes the compendious book of calculating by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation. Snappy title, Al-Khwarizmi. In fact, such a snappy title that no one ever calls it that. It's known by a nickname as Al-Jabr. And Al-Jabr is the English word algebra. And Al-Khwarizmi is the English word algorithm. So this is where all this stuff comes from. Next slide. So this travels across the Arab world. Next slide. Along with chess, another Indian invention which is moving at the same sort of time. Next slide. So look at the far right. You've got Sindh, where the copy of Aryabhatta is coming from. We travel to Iraq, just in the center, where Al-Khwarizmi translates it. And this work passes through Palestine, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, and reaches Spain by the 9th century. Because Al-Khwarizmi's work is so clear that even school children can understand it. So it becomes the basic text in the Arab world. And he is very clear. As he said, he called it the Hindu calculation. He's not appropriating Indian learning, he's explaining Indian learning and calling it such. Now, all this time, you get a few Christian monks coming down to Spain to learn this system in the 9th century. But Europe overwhelmingly remains still using the old Latin numbers up until the 12th century, when a notary from Pisa founds a customs house in Algeria, and he brings his kids with him. And just like my kids growing up in Delhi learnt Hindi as a matter of course, and were about 3 years ahead of their English friends in mathematics even now, by the time they went to school in England. So this young man brought up in Algeria, when he goes back to Pisa, he finds all his friends are still doing MCV XV1 times CCCM XV2. And he realizes they need help, so he writes a book. Next slide. And it is the young Leonardo of Pisa, who we know as Fibonacci. Lucky break, Europe. Next slide. And he writes a book explaining Al-Khwarizmi. So it's a relay race. We start with Aryabhatta, we pass to Brahmagupta. Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta are translated by Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi is turned into Latin and reversioned by Fibonacci. And so finally, 600 years after Udaygiri and the Guptas, these number systems finally reach Europe. Next slide. Now, luckily, at the same time, there is a very clever Holy Roman Emperor called Frederick II Stupor Mundi. He hears about this brilliant young man in Pisa, and he takes his whole court to Pisa with his camels and his giraffes and his menagerie, and they have a sort of public maths contest. And, of course, Fibonacci, being Fibonacci, wipes the floor with everyone else, and he's invited to court. Next slide. And there, and this is the important point which I need to emphasize, he meets a Scotsman, none other than Michael Scott, who is the court astrologer. And Michael Scott is a canny, pragmatic Scot, and he says, look here, Fibonacci, this is all very well, all this highfalutin theoretical stuff you've written, but we need it to be more practical. And he gets Fibonacci to write a second edition, which has interest rates, double accounting, weights and measures, and a whole variety of other useful tricks for merchants. Currency conversion, that sort of stuff. So the second edition of the Liber Abaci is the one that spreads through Italy. Next slide. The Medici use it. The Medici Bank is founded on the principles of Fibonacci. Next slide. Renaissance painters like Piero della Francesca use it to calculate perspective. Piero della Francesca writes 3 treatises on mathematics based on Fibonacci in his exploration of perspective. And he then has his work plagiarized by his friend Luca de Caroli, who takes it up to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who is, wait for it, Leonardo da Vinci, and who's then working on the Last Supper in Milan. So you could argue, final slide, final slide please, that the European corporation, the European banks, are a case of Europe using the weapons of India against Indians. And it is, of course, a corporation, the East India Company, which conquers India in the 18th century using accounting techniques. At the time of the Battle of Plassey, there are only 250 Goras, white guys, in India. They don't fight the Battle of Plassey, sepoy mercenaries do. And they do it paid for by the loans of the Marwari Jagat sets. So it's not a matter of superior Western arms, although that does play into it too. It's a matter of merchants using interest rates, commercial contracts, and double accounting to conquer what was then the richest country in the world. But the East India Company is, as they say, a different story. Thank you very much for another day. Thank you. Thank you. Have we run out of time, or is there time for questions? Run out of time.
So, after this breathtaking, jaw-dropping, eye-popping tour de force, we have another tour de force, a musical one.